At a bustling airport terminal, an elderly man stood quietly with a first-class ticket in hand until a gate agent told him otherwise. What followed involved a forgotten war hero, a silent middle-seat economy, and a sudden visit from the airline's highest executive. What could have caused such a dramatic reversal? Stay with us and don't forget to hit subscribe before we begin. The terminal at O'Hare bustled with its usual chaos. Families gathered around suitcases. Business travelers hunched over phones, and the steady drone of flight announcements echoing off the high ceilings. Among them, 83-year-old Elliot Graham walked with deliberate steps, his leather shoes clicking softly against the polished floor. Clad in pressed slacks and a modest navy blazer, he looked like any other elderly man traveling alone. Few noticed the subtle tremor in his hands or the way his right shoulder sloped ever so slightly, a silent echo from a battle fought long ago in the frozen hills of Korea. Elliot was headed to New York for something special, a commemorative event at the Veterans Memorial Hall, where he and a handful of others would be honored for their service. His granddaughter, Nina, a nurse working double shifts, had scraped together her savings and frequent flyer points to buy him a first-class ticket. "You've earned this, Grandpa," she'd said. "You shouldn't be in pain on that long flight. With boarding pass in hand, seat 2A. Window, first class." Elliot approached gate B19 with a quiet pride. The airline sign blinked above Empire Air Flight 702. At the podium stood a woman with tightly pulled hair and a laminated name tag, Maggie. She was tapping quickly on her keyboard, her expression a blend of focus and fatigue. As Elliot stepped forward, she gave a perfunctory smile. "Good afternoon," he offered, placing the pass on the counter. Her eyes flicked to the screen, then back at him. The smile faded. "Mr. Graham, I'm afraid there's been a last-minute aircraft change," she said, tone clipped and rehearsed. "Your new seat assignment is 37C. Elliot blinked. "I believe there's a mistake. That's economy." "Yeah, sir. The new aircraft has a reduced first-class cabin. We had to prioritize Diamond Elite members. Your ticket was purchased using points, so unfortunately, you didn't make the cut." He frowned, gently. "Miss, I'm traveling for a veterans recognition event. My granddaughter worked hard to book that seat. I have chronic back issues. I can't sit for hours in a cramped middle row." Maggie's eyes remained on the screen. "Our policies are clear. Seat assignments are not guaranteed. 37C is what we can offer under the current configuration." There was no apology, no attempt to look up, only the rustle of the freshly printed economy boarding pass she pushed toward him. Elliot stared at it, a flimsy piece of paper that now felt heavier than any metal he'd ever carried. He nodded once politely, quietly, and took the pass. He turned without another word, walking slowly toward an empty seat near the window. As he sat down, the overhead speaker chirped first-class boarding now for Empire Air Flight 702. Elliot didn't look up. He simply folded the boarding pass in half, placed it on his knee, and stared into the middle distance. It wasn't about luxury. It was about something far older and far more forgotten: respect. The boarding call echoed once more: first-class passengers. "Please proceed to gate B19, but Elliot Graham remained still. The thin slip of paper, folded neatly on his lap, felt like a dismissal written in ink. Around him, hurried travelers clutched rolling luggage and phone chargers, rushing toward destinations that would never ask them to prove their worth. Elliot sat quietly among them, a man once responsible for dozens of lives in war, now reduced to a seat number. He leaned back in the hard plastic chair and let the buzz of the terminal fade into the background. His thoughts drifted not with bitterness, but with a familiar heaviness. He remembered the blistering heat of the DMZ, the tremble of frozen fingers wrapped around rifle triggers, the men who'd never made it home. In those moments, leadership meant protecting others at all costs. Not once had he lost a man because of policy, or denied someone a place beside him based on a spreadsheet. Yet here he was, 83, set aside because a computer said someone else mattered more. He sighed and reached for his wallet, The card Nina had slipped in glinted under the terminal lights. Empire Air Veteran Liaison Desk. 24/7 support for decorated military travelers. He had brushed it off when she gave it to him. Just in case, Grandpa, she'd said. They're supposed to treat people like you with care. People like him. He hesitated, then unfolded the card fully and dialed the number. The line didn't ring more than twice. This is Jerome, Empire Air Veteran Liaison. How may I assist you today? Elliot cleared his throat. My name is Elliot Graham. I was scheduled on Flight 702, Seat 2A. I've just been reassigned to 37C at the gate. The agent said it was due to an aircraft change. Jerome's voice didn't miss a beat. Yeah, sir. Let me pull up your reservation. May I have your booking number? Elliot read it off the corner of the new boarding pass. Thank you, Colonel Graham. The title caught Elliot slightly off guard. He hadn't heard it in years. Not from a stranger. I see you were booked for first class to New York for a Veterans Honors event. Let me review what happened. The line went silent, filled only with the soft clacking of keys and the muffled noise of the airport around Elliot. He sat with the phone pressed to his ear, staring across the terminal as if watching a battle unfold across time. Jerome returned, his tone lower, now carrying a weight of urgency. Colonel, I'd like to offer my sincere apologies. This reassignment should not have happened, especially not under Empire Air's veteran protocol. I'm escalating this to our executive response team. Please remain at gate B19. Someone will be with you shortly. Very shortly. Elliot nodded reflexively. Thank you. The line went dead. He tucked the phone and the card away, not sure what to expect. Escalation in bureaucratic systems often meant little more than another loop in a larger maze. He had seen that play out too many times in VA hospitals and federal offices, too many men and women filling out the same forms, telling the same stories, getting the same empty nods. But this was different. Jerome had used his title. He had sounded like he meant it. The boarding continued. Families with children, travelers in sharp suits, a man clutching a saxophone case. Flight attendants in navy blue called out last names from clipboards. And then, nearly 8 minutes after the call, the hum of the terminal changed. There was a shift in air pressure, not from a plane, but from presence. A ripple of attention moved through the passengers as a small group approached the gate at a determined pace. At the center of the entourage was a tall, composed woman in a charcoal gray suit. Her heels clicked with urgency, her expression unreadable. Elliot saw her only briefly before she stopped directly in front of Maggie, the gate agent. Words were exchanged. Maggie's eyes widened. She gestured, almost unwillingly, toward where Elliot sat. The woman crossed the short distance quickly. She stopped before him and knelt slightly so that her gaze met his directly. Colonel Graham, she said, voice low but clear. I'm Madeline York, President of Empire Air. May I speak with you, Elliot? Surprised by the intensity of her presence, nodded. I'm deeply sorry, she said. What happened at this gate is not only unacceptable, it's dishonorable. I know you didn't call us looking for attention, but you deserve so much better than this. Elliot studied her, noting the tightness in her jaw, the perspiration at her temple. She wasn't reading from a script. This wasn't damage control. This was a woman genuinely ashamed. I appreciate you coming, he replied quietly. But it wasn't about comfort. It was about what that seat symbolized. I understand, she said, her voice tight with emotion. And we've failed at that symbol. I've ordered the flight held. You'll be reassigned to 1A. If that means bumping one of our senior executives or me, we will do it. You're going to New York the way you should have from the beginning. Elliot blinked slowly, unsure whether to speak or simply nod. She continued. Your future travel and that of your family will be fully covered by Empire Air. This is only a gesture, but it's one we offer with sincerity. From a short distance, Maggie stood frozen, her posture rigid, as if she knew what was coming. Madeline added, glancing briefly over her shoulder. There will be policy changes, effective today. Elliot finally allowed himself a breath. "You didn't have to do this," he said, "but I'm glad someone remembered." Madeline smiled faintly. "Some things are too important to forget." And just like that, Elliot rose slowly from his chair, not with pride, not with resentment, but with the quiet steadiness of a man who had carried far more than a suitcase through life. The flimsy boarding pass crumpled softly in his coat pocket. It didn't matter anymore. Respect, like valor, didn't fade. It only needed to be seen again. The weight of the crumpled boarding pass still sat in Elliot's pocket, though now it felt like something distant, like a chapter that had closed quietly when Madeline York knelt beside him and offered what the system had failed to give: genuine recognition. But if her quiet apology had been the first breeze of change, what followed was a storm. Less than 10 minutes after the call with the liaison desk, Gate 11 transformed. What had once been a blur of casual movement and idle chatter became a stage of heightened energy. The tension arrived before the people did. Passengers turned their heads as whispers moved faster than announcements. A line of figures in dark suits appeared at the far end of the terminal, striding forward with urgency. Their shoes clapped hard against the tiles, out of rhythm with the calm airport hum. At the center of the group was a tall woman in her early 40s, shoulders squared, her pace unrelenting. Her charcoal suit looked as if it had been put on in haste. Sweat had already formed along her hairline despite the aggressive air conditioning. She moved like someone whose presence alone silenced meetings. It was Madeline York, President and CEO of Empire Air. She didn't wait for protocol. She didn't glance at the security staff that trailed behind her. She reached the gate and stormed directly to the counter, where Maggie and her younger colleague, Trevor, froze mid-motion. Maggie's fingers hovered over her keyboard, eyes wide. Trevor stepped back instinctively, his scanning device held like a useless relic in his hand. "Where is Colonel Elliot Graham?" Madeline demanded, her voice sharp and controlled. Maggie hesitated, glancing toward the corner where Elliot still sat. She raised a hand, then lowered it, pointing hesitantly. "By the window. Ma'am, right there." Madeline didn't thank her. She walked briskly toward the old man, the entourage behind her scattering briefly as she knelt again, this time with the weight of eyes and silence pressing from all sides. "Colonel Graham," she said, more softly than before, "please allow me to say, face to face, how deeply sorry I am for what happened." Elliot, who had stood upon her approach, offered a small nod. "Miss York, what you experienced at our gate is not who we are, or at least, not who we strive to be. We failed you utterly. Not because of an aircraft change, but because we forgot the difference between a policy and a principle." Passengers nearby had stopped moving entirely. Phones began to lift. Fingers hovered over record buttons. Somewhere, an airport employee turned off the nearby television to mute the ambient noise. All focus fell on the woman in the suit and the man with weathered eyes. Madeline continued, her voice unwavering. "You had a confirmed seat in first class. A seat purchased with care, for a purpose that deserved to be honored. That it was given away to someone with more loyalty points rather than more history is shameful. And I accept full responsibility." Elliot studied her closely. She wasn't reading a statement. This was not corporate theater. This was personal. "We've delayed the flight," she said, gesturing toward the podium. "You will be flying in seat 1A. If that requires removing an executive or myself, so be it. You will travel in comfort. You will arrive with dignity. You will be seen." Trevor, standing behind Maggie, looked like he wanted to applaud. Maggie, by contrast, had gone pale. She glanced around nervously, her lips pressed into a hard, silent line. "And," Madeline added, "from this moment forward, any and all future travel by you or your family with Empire Air will be complimentary. First class. No exceptions. It's the very least we can do." There was no applause. Not yet. But something changed in the air. Something heavy began to lift. The quiet rage that had surrounded Elliot's quiet isolation at the gate was being transformed into something rare, public accountability. Elliot gave a small, almost apologetic smile. Thank you, Ms. York. But I didn't ask for all this. I know, she said. That's why it matters. She stood slowly, straightening her jacket, then turned to the staff behind the counter. Mr. Trevor, please escort Colonel Graham personally onto the aircraft. Ensure he is comfortable. Maggie, she paused, her voice hardening like steel drawn slowly from a sheath. I will be speaking with you and your supervisor after this flight departs. You may wish to review the meaning of hero liaison before then. Maggie swallowed, her composure cracking. Yes, ma'am. The passengers began to murmur again, this time with something closer to awe. Trevor stepped forward, walking with Elliot toward the boarding ramp. He said nothing at first, only glanced sideways with a mixture of shame and admiration. You were the one who looked like you wanted to say something earlier, Elliot said, without judgment. Trevor nodded. I knew it was wrong, but I froze. That happens, Elliot replied. It's what you do after that counts. Trevor nodded again, but this time with more weight. Thank you, sir. As they reached the ramp, Elliot looked back at the gate area. People were still watching, some filming, others just standing in quiet respect. Madeline was already conferring with her team, gesturing with sharp movements and pointing toward the customer service monitors. The storm at Gate 11 had passed, but the skies it left behind were clearer. Something had shifted not just for Elliot, but for the dozens who witnessed the encounter. In the sterile halls of a major airport, surrounded by efficiency and algorithm, humanity had briefly taken center stage. And Elliot, once overlooked, had become the man no one dared ignore. The doors to the jet bridge closed slowly behind them, but the moment at Gate 11 still lingered in Elliot's mind like a ripple refusing to settle. As Trevor walked just a step behind, Elliot paused before entering the aircraft, his hand brushing against the edge of the boarding door. He turned slightly and said quietly to the young man beside him, "It was never about the seat. You know, I didn't come here expecting luxury. I just thought someone might remember." Trevor, his face flushed, nodded. "They will now, sir." Inside the plane, the first-class cabin shimmered with soft light and silence. The flight crew greeted Elliot like royalty, though he only offered a modest nod. His new seat 1A sat at the front, beside the window, with space enough for his back to rest without strain. A soft wool blanket and a fresh glass of water awaited him. As he settled in, Madeline York briefly appeared at the door of the aircraft, her composure now restored, though her eyes remained sharp. She walked down the aisle and stopped by his seat. "Colonel Graham," she began, her voice now measured but still sincere. "I want you to know I didn't come to that gate because of public pressure. There wasn't time for that. I came because someone in my organization remembered who we're supposed to be." Elliot looked up at her. "And who is that?" She hesitated and then said, "An airline that values its passengers not just by what they paid, but by what they've paid into the world." He considered that for a moment. "Then I hope you understand what happened wasn't just a mistake. It was a message, one that said people like me are invisible unless someone intervenes." Madeline's jaw tightened. "I understand now. I didn't before, but I do now." She straightened and added, "After this flight, there will be policy meetings, mandatory ones, and Maggie will be reassigned to a position that doesn't involve passengers until she learns what service means." Elliot raised an eyebrow. "And the young man Trevor A. report has already come in. He documented the incident internally before you even made your call," she said with a hint of pride. "He's being moved to a supervisory training program. We need more people like him." Elliot gave a slow nod of approval, then leaned back in his seat. "Sometimes it's not the system that's broken. It's the people hiding behind it." Madeline placed a hand briefly on the seat in front of him, then turned to leave. The gesture had been made. Now, it had to be followed through. As the engines roared to life and the aircraft began to taxi, Elliot gazed out the window, letting the clouds blur past. He thought of Nina, her excitement, her sacrifice to make this trip possible. She would be proud, but he wasn't sure he'd ever tell her what had really happened. Not because it was shameful, but because it was finished. The moment had passed, and in its place something stronger had been planted. Meanwhile, back at the terminal, Maggie sat in the employee lounge, her fingers twisted tightly together. Her supervisor had already spoken to her once sternly, without anger, but with unmistakable clarity. "You saw a man, Maggie, but not who he was." She didn't respond. The truth was heavy, and it had settled onto her shoulders. Across the hallway, Trevor stood before a corporate panel. He didn't look confident, but he looked resolute. "I hesitated," he admitted, "and I regret that. But I also reported it because I knew it was wrong. Not just the downgrade, but the way we brushed him off. It was cold, like he was an inconvenience." The VP of Customer Experience looked up from her notes. "And why do you think you were able to recognize that?" "Mr. Reeves," Trevor shrugged. "My grandfather was a Marine. He never asked for thanks either." Just fairness. The panel exchanged brief glances. One of them scribbled a note beside Trevor's name, "Leadership Potential." Meanwhile, in a quiet cabin 30,000 feet in the air, Elliot drifted in and out of a light doze. The hum of the engines was familiar, steady and constant, like the lull of distant artillery in a memory softened by time. But somewhere between his fading thoughts and the sound of the flight attendant offering warm towels, a line from decades ago returned to him. Respect is not something a uniform earns. It's something people choose to give or to withhold. He hadn't wanted a confrontation. He had only wanted dignity to outlast the noise. Now, as the aircraft coasted through sunlit skies toward New York, it seemed for a moment that it just might. A few hours later, as the wheels touched down and applause rippled softly through the cabin, Elliot kept his hands still on his lap. He didn't need validation, but he appreciated the silence that followed, the way the crew looked him in the eye as he disembarked. One of the junior attendants stepped forward as he reached the door. She looked nervous. "Sir, my grandfather served too. He used to talk about men like you." Elliot smiled gently. "Then make sure his stories don't stay just stories." She nodded, biting her lip to hold back tears. As Elliot stepped onto the jet bridge, a thought passed through his mind, not bitter, not triumphant, but quietly resolved. It had never been about class. It had always been about clarity, about reminding those who had forgotten that honor's not a transaction. It's a principle, and principles, once shaken, must be stood upon again. The sun had just begun to set as Elliot stepped out of the terminal at LaGuardia, suitcase in hand, back held straighter than it had in years. The ceremony was still a day away, but something within him already felt concluded. He didn't tell Nina what had happened, not because it wasn't important, but because the outcome had already spoken louder than any retelling ever could. "I'm fine, sweetheart," he had said when she called. Just a little turbulence on the ground. But the storm Elliot weathered at Gate 11 did not stay confined to that terminal. Within 24 hours, the story had begun to ripple through the networks of military forums, veteran organizations, and news outlets. It started as a whispered anecdote. "Did you hear about the Medal of Honor vet bumped from first class and evolved into something larger? Something symbolic?" A grainy cell phone video captured the exact moment Madeline York approached Elliot, flanked by her senior executives. In it, her voice could be heard steady, sincere as she said, "You will be seen." The clip, uploaded to a veteran's message board, was picked up by a small military blog. From there, it was shared by a retired Air Force general on social media. Within hours, it was viral. The comments poured in, some with outrage, many with gratitude. "My dad flew coach with 2 herniated discs after Iraq. This hits hard. Finally, someone stood up for our elders. I've avoided Empire Air for years. If they're changing, I'll reconsider." Within 72 hours, The weight of public attention forced Empire Air's board of directors to act. At an emergency meeting chaired by Madeline herself, a new internal policy was proposed and unanimously passed. It was called the Callahan Protocol, named not for Elliot Graham, but for a fellow veteran whose similar experience had never been addressed, and whose story had long been forgotten, Colonel Joseph Callahan, a push-to-push hero who had died quietly after being overlooked one too many times. The protocol included 5 key directives: immediate priority reassignment. Any Medal of Honor recipient or comparable decorated veteran must be reseated in the highest available class, even if it requires displacing a paying customer or staff member. Veteran Liaison Team expansion. A trained team would be on call 24/7 to monitor bookings of decorated veterans, flagging them for proactive assistance before travel, not after incidents occurred. Human oversight override. Any automated reseating process involving veterans flagged by the system would require review by a live, senior staff member before implementation. Mandatory empathy training. Every gate agent, customer service rep, and corporate decision maker would undergo quarterly training, not in efficiency, but in decency. This program was to be built around real testimonies from veterans and their families. Public accountability reporting. Quarterly disclosures, made public, would include how many veteran-related complaints or accommodations were handled to ensure transparency and accountability. The memo announcing these changes was issued under Madeline's signature. It began with a single line: "We forgot what respect looks like. This is how we remember." Back in Chicago, Maggie sat in a windowless room within the HR department. She was still technically employed, but her duties had been stripped of all public interaction. The walls of her new office were bare, the phone rarely rang, and her inbox remained almost empty. She had been ordered to complete the new empathy training program before she could be considered for reassignment. It was not optional. The modules included footage of Elliot's boarding incident. She had to watch herself, the way her mouth tightened, the way she refused to look him in the eye. By the end of the video, she was no longer angry at the backlash. She was ashamed. Meanwhile, Trevor Reeves had been invited to New York, not for a disciplinary hearing, but for recognition. A letter arrived at his apartment, signed by Madeline York herself, requesting his presence at a corporate summit. His report, filed discreetly before the story went public, had become a case study in ethical courage. At the summit, Trevor stood nervously behind a lectern, reading from handwritten notes. "I'm not a hero," he said simply. "I froze at the gate when I should have said something, but I made sure someone knew. And if there's one thing I've learned from this, it's that silence isn't neutral. It has consequences." The audience stood to applaud him, not because he had been perfect, but because he had chosen the harder road when it mattered. As all this unfolded, Elliot remained in New York, away from headlines and speeches. The ceremony at the Veterans Memorial Hall was intimate and dignified. He wore his uniform one last time. The weight of it still surprised him, the way memory was stitched into every thread. When his name was called, he accepted his commendation with the same humility he'd carried his entire life. No one in the room knew about the boarding pass, or the gate agents, or the CEO who had knelt beside him. That story lived elsewhere now. After the ceremony, he and Nina shared a quiet dinner in a small Italian restaurant off Lexington Avenue. She beamed with pride. He listened, smiled, nodded. When she finally asked how the flight had gone, he paused for a moment, then said, "Let's just say there are still good people in the sky." Later that week, Empire Air launched a short video campaign featuring veterans sharing their travel stories, some painful, some uplifting. At the end of the first video, white text faded onto a black screen. True honor isn't reserved for medals. It's reflected in the moments when we choose to remember. The final shot was a still photo, an elderly man in a blazer, looking out a window from Seat 1A, a folded flag pin on his lapel. He wasn't named, but everyone who had seen what happened at Gate 11 already knew. The ceremony was over, the medals handed out, the photographs taken, the hands shaken. Elliot had worn his uniform with quiet pride, then folded it neatly away into the past once again. Now, sitting aboard the return flight to Chicago, he found himself in Cite 1A once more, this time without tension, without confrontation, without the weight of having to explain why he deserved to be there. A flight attendant placed a fresh cup of coffee on the tray in front of him. "We're honored to have you on board, Colonel Graham," she said softly. Elliot smiled with the same quiet grace he had shown the president of the airline, the summit panel, and the roomful of dignitaries just 2 nights ago. "Thank you," he replied. "But please, just Elliot." She nodded, and he took a sip of the hot coffee, its warmth soaking into fingers that had once wrapped around steel in a faraway war zone. Now they cradled porcelain and peace. He gazed out the window. The clouds, bright white and soft as linen, stretched endlessly in all directions. The sunlight reflected off the wingtip and landed gently across his lap, illuminating the creases in his slacks, the silver thread of his wristwatch, and the faint tremble in his hand. Age had carved its signature into him, but it had not diminished the steadiness of his gaze. A young man seated across the aisle leaned over slightly and whispered, "Excuse me, sir. Were you the veteran from that thing with the airline CEO at the gate?" Elliot turned slowly and studied the young man's face, earnest, a little nervous, maybe mid-20s. He wore earbuds draped around his neck and a sweatshirt with a college logo on the chest. "Depends what you heard," Elliot said with a faint smile. "They said you made the president of Empire Air come down to the terminal in person," the young man said, "that she held the whole plane for you." Elliot chuckled softly. "I didn't make anyone do anything. A few good people did what was right. That's all." The young man sat back, but not before adding, "Well, my grandfather would have loved to meet you." Elliot gave a small nod and returned to his window. He didn't need the attention. He hadn't needed the coffee or the priority lane or the complimentary flights. What had mattered was something intangible, something larger than perks and seating charts. Respect. Not the kind scribbled in policy manuals or handed out with plastic wings, but the kind that took shape through action when someone, somewhere, decided not to look away. He traced the rim of the coffee cup with his thumb, recalling the dozens of flights over the years, many of them in silence. Coach flights with cramped knees and restless neighbors, airports where no one made eye contact, uniforms packed deep in bags so as not to draw attention. And yet now, in the twilight of life, he had been seen not just for what he had done, but for who he still was. At cruising altitude, the captain's voice came through the intercom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we'd like to take a moment to acknowledge a very special passenger with us today, Colonel Elliot Graham, recipient of the Medal of Honor, who served his country with courage and distinction. On behalf of our entire crew and company, we thank you for your service." There was a brief pause, then soft applause from throughout the cabin. Elliot closed his eyes for a second, breathing through the stillness of the moment. He didn't crave it, but it meant something. After the announcement, the attendant returned, this time with a warm towel and a small, folded envelope. "It's from our captain," she whispered. Inside was a handwritten note. "Colonel Graham, you may not remember me, but I was 12 when you spoke at my uncle's memorial in Springfield. You told us that valor is quiet and steady. I never forgot that. Today, I get to fly you home. With deepest respect, Captain Henry K." Dalton Elliot folded the note carefully and tucked it into his breast pocket. Outside, the clouds thinned. The golden light of late afternoon streamed across the sky, touching everything it could reach. Elliot leaned back in his seat, sipping his coffee, the hum of the engines now familiar and gentle. He thought of systems, how vast and impersonal they could feel. He thought of Maggie and Trevor, of Madeline York, of Jerome at the other end of a phone line. Each had made a choice, and those choices had added up to something more than an apology. They had formed a course correction. They had proven that even in systems built for efficiency, compassion could still break through. As the plane began its descent into Chicago, the city's lights emerging faintly in the distance, Elliot placed the coffee cup aside and reached for the window. His fingers rested on the cool surface. For years, he had sat in crowded terminals and noisy gates, moving through the world like a relic admired in theory, forgotten in practice. But not today. Not this time. The landing gear extended. The runway grew nearer. And Elliot, with the same quiet dignity that had guided him through war and peace alike, whispered to himself, "True first class isn't a seat. It's how you're remembered when no one thinks you're watching." And this time, the world had watched, and chosen well.